R. Kelly spoke with the confidence of a man who truly believed he would never be convicted. For years, he publicly denied every accusation, dismissed every allegation, and carried himself as if the legal system would once again fail to touch him. So when the verdict finally came back guilty and the judge handed down a 30-year prison sentence, it shocked not only his supporters, but many people who had watched him escape accountability for decades. But now, years after the courtroom drama that once dominated headlines,
Because for one, I beat my case. When you beat
You
something,
were
you beat
acquitted.
it.
new revelations have exposed an even darker and more disturbing side of the story, and the public reaction has been filled with anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. This is the story of a case that, for many people, never truly felt finished. On February 8, 2002, the Chicago Sun-Times received an anonymous package in the mail. Inside was a videotape that would eventually become one of the most infamous pieces of evidence in entertainment history.
My son was the biggest reason I decided to write the book. Nobody is more qualified to speak on my experience more than I.
According to the newspaper's reporting at the time, the footage allegedly showed R. Kelly, already one of the biggest stars in R&B music, engaging in sexual acts with a girl who appeared to be underage, including an act of urination that would later become central to the scandal. The tape immediately ignited outrage across the country. Kelly denied everything. He insisted the man in the video was not him, despite widespread public belief to the contrary. But the controversy escalated rapidly.
I really wanted him to have the true narrative of what really took place.
On June 5, 2002, he was indicted on 21 counts related to child pornography. Authorities arrested him in Miami, and after posting a staggering $750,000 bail, he prepared for what would become one of the most closely watched celebrity trials of the 2000s. For years, the case dragged on through delays, legal maneuvering, and non-stop media attention.
It was the only true way I could reclaim my name, Re'Shona Landfair.
The public watched every development closely, expecting a dramatic conclusion. But when the trial finally ended on June 13, 2008, the verdict stunned millions of people following the case. R. Kelly was acquitted on all 14 remaining counts. To many observers, it felt impossible. The prosecution's case collapsed for one devastating reason that people still discuss to this day. The alleged victim in the videotape never testified that she was the girl shown in the footage.
Happened? Why did anybody advocate for you? Did anybody speak out for you?
Throughout the trial, she was referred to only as Jane Doe. Without direct confirmation from her, prosecutors struggled to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person in the tape was actually a minor. That single missing piece created enough uncertainty for the jury to return a not guilty verdict. And just like that, Kelly walked free. For years afterward, the case remained trapped in a deeply uncomfortable place, unresolved, controversial, and emotionally devastating for the person at the center of it all.
To view the tape, to identify myself, and to be able to fully tell.
The world argued endlessly about guilt, innocence, celebrity power, and justice, while the young woman whose life had been permanently altered stayed almost completely silent in public. That young woman was Re'Shona Landfair. She was only 14 years old when the videotape was recorded. Landfair grew up in Chicago in a family with ties to the music industry. Like many teenagers surrounded by music culture, she dreamed of performing herself one day.
You have to go through to get to this point, to be vocal and identify yourself.
One of her relatives was Sparkle, the R&B singer who had professional connections to Kelly during the 1990s. Through those family and industry relationships, Landfair eventually entered Kelly's world while still incredibly young. At that time, R. Kelly appeared untouchable. He had sold more than 75 million records worldwide, won multiple Grammy Awards, and created some of the biggest songs of an entire generation. Records like I Believe I Can Fly, Ignition, and Bump and Grind made him not just a celebrity, but a cultural icon. To a young girl in Chicago with musical ambitions, simply being around someone like R. Kelly could feel life-changing, like an opportunity, a dream, or the beginning of a future in music. Instead, it became the beginning of a nightmare. For over 20 years, the public only knew the girl from the tape as Jane Doe. Her identity remained hidden, while lawyers, journalists, prosecutors, documentary filmmakers, and television commentators debated her story from every angle. But now, for the first time, Re'Shona Landfair has chosen to speak publicly in her own words, and that decision changes everything. Because for years, the RKelly story was always told about her. Now, finally, it is being told by her. Her testimony and public statements pull back the curtain on details that had remained hidden for decades. She describes not only what allegedly happened behind closed doors, but how the grooming process worked, what people around her did and did not understand, and why it took so many years before she felt capable of speaking openly. Most importantly, her account sheds light on why the 2008 trial ended the way it did. There was one person who knew the truth more clearly than anyone else the entire time, and that was Landfair herself.
A lot of prayer. It took a lot of forgiveness of myself, the people around me, and just really confronting who I really was.
This is the story of Re'Shona Landfair, who she was before any of this happened, how she became connected to one of the most powerful figures in music, and the devastating emotional cost those experiences carried into the rest of her life. To fully understand what happened to her, you also have to understand the environment surrounding RKelly during the 1990s. At that point in time, Kelly was more than just a famous singer. In the Chicago black music community, he was a towering figure whose influence extended far beyond records and concerts. Born on January 8, 1967, in Chicago's Hyde Park neighborhood and raised in the Ida B. Wells public housing projects, Kelly came from the same city, the same cultural environment, and often the same neighborhoods as many of the families connected to his eventual victims. That closeness mattered. He did not feel like some unreachable Hollywood celebrity. He was present in local churches, talent shows, recording studios, community events, and music circles. People knew him personally or knew somebody connected to him. Parents trusted him because he came from where they came from. Young aspiring singers looked at him as proof that someone from their community could reach superstardom. And by the late 1990s, his influence was enormous. He had worked with artists like Aaliyah, produced Michael Jackson's hit You Were Alone, and blended gospel, soul, and R&B into music that resonated deeply across black communities throughout America. His image was carefully built around inspiration, faith, romance, and emotional vulnerability.
The RKelly girl. There's so much more to me than what happened to me when I was 14 years old.
Behind that image, according to numerous allegations and later convictions, something far darker was happening.
He was praised from church pulpits. His music echoed through family cookouts, birthday parties, weddings, and neighborhood gatherings. To millions of people, RKelly was not just an entertainer, he was part of the culture itself. So when a young girl from Chicago, with dreams of becoming a singer, crossed paths with someone like RKelly, it did not feel dangerous. It did not feel like stepping into harm's way. It felt like destiny. And one detail in particular changes the way you look at the entire story. He first appeared around her through a church performance. Think carefully about what that setting represents. Church is supposed to symbolize safety, trust, guidance, and community protection. For many black families in Chicago during that era, church was one of the few spaces where people felt secure. So when a globally famous R&B superstar showed up around church talent performances and local singers, it lowered people's guard automatically. The environment itself created a sense of legitimacy. Re'Shona Landfair was still a teenager, but she already had dreams of building a singing career. Music mattered to her. It gave her purpose and identity. And standing in front of her was a man who represented everything those ambitions could potentially become: fame, success, money, admiration, and escape from ordinary life. That matters because according to experts who study grooming and predatory behavior, Ambition is often the doorway predators use to gain emotional access. The goal is not to frighten the victim in the beginning. The goal is to become indispensable. Psychologists who specialize in abuse patterns frequently describe the same process. The predator identifies something the victim desperately wants: validation, opportunity, mentorship, love, protection, or success, and then positions themselves as the one person capable of providing it. That emotional positioning creates trust and dependency long before any obvious boundary is crossed. And according to Landfair's own descriptions in interviews and in her memoir, Who's Watching Shorty, that is exactly how the relationship allegedly developed. What began as simple introductions through family and music industry connections slowly became more personal. Kelly praised her talent. He gave her special attention. He allegedly made her feel unique, chosen, and emotionally important in ways that separated her from everyone else around her. At first glance, none of those things necessarily look criminal. That is part of what makes grooming so difficult to identify while it is happening, because it rarely begins with obvious abuse. It happens gradually, step by step, boundary by boundary. Every interaction feels like only a slightly more personal version of the one before it. A compliment becomes private conversations become emotional dependence becomes secrecy, and secrecy becomes control. Each stage can be rationalized individually. Nothing feels dramatic enough to trigger alarm bells immediately, and by the time the situation clearly crosses the line into something deeply wrong, the victim is often already emotionally trapped, socially isolated, psychologically manipulated, or financially dependent. That slow escalation is what makes these situations so devastating. And according to multiple accounts surrounding Kelly's inner circle during that time, many people around him allegedly found ways to convince themselves not to fully confront what they were witnessing. That detail stays with people. Not necessarily that nobody saw warning signs, but that many people may have chosen not to fully acknowledge them. Because this pattern is not unique to the RKelly case. It appears repeatedly in scandals involving powerful individuals across churches, sports organizations, Hollywood, politics, and entertainment industries. Fame creates gravity, wealth creates silence, influence creates fear, and together, those forces can produce a kind of collective denial where people talk themselves out of believing what is directly in front of them. That denial always comes with a price. By the late 1990s, when the infamous videotape was recorded, Landfair was only 14 years old. By her account, she had already spent years inside Kelly's orbit by that point, and according to her later statements, recording sexual encounters was not unusual within that environment. It was normalized. That distinction became critically important years later because prosecutors would eventually argue that Kelly's behavior was not simply a series of isolated, inappropriate relationships, but part of a much larger and more organized pattern of exploitation and control. According to Landfair, she was also unaware at the time that she had allegedly been given alcohol. The emotional weight of everything that happened did not fully hit her immediately. In many ways, she says the reality only became clear years later, after adulthood, after public humiliation, and after the entire world had already debated her trauma for years without hearing from her directly. One of the most painful details is that she reportedly didn't even watch the videotape herself until she was sitting in a courtroom as an adult. Imagine what that means psychologically. By then, the footage had already circulated publicly for years. Countless strangers had seen it. Media outlets had discussed it endlessly. Comedians joked about it. Radio hosts debated it. The country turned it into scandal in spectacle before the girl at the center of it had even fully processed what had happened to her. And then came the trial. The 2008 case remains one of the most controversial celebrity trials of its era because of what it revealed about fear, power, celebrity influence, and the limitations of the justice system. RKelly had originally been indicted in 2002, but endless legal motions and delays stretched the proceedings out for years.
By the time the trial finally began in 2007, public opinion had become strangely divided. Despite the allegations, Kelly continued releasing hit music, continued touring, and in many places continued being embraced by fans who either doubted the allegations or simply separated the allegations from the artist. The prosecution built its case around the videotape itself, arguing that the people shown were clearly Kelly and an underage girl. But the defense attacked one issue relentlessly: identification. And when the critical moment arrived, the moment where the alleged victim could directly confirm she was the girl in the tape, she did not testify publicly that it was her. Years later, Landfair explained why. Fear. Not vague fear, not abstract fear, real fear. Fear of humiliation, fear of public exposure, fear of retaliation, fear of facing one of the most powerful entertainers in America in a courtroom while the entire country was watching. Fear of carrying the emotional burden of reliving traumatic experiences in front of strangers, cameras, lawyers, and headlines. By the time of Kelly's later federal proceedings years afterwards, she says she was finally emotionally ready to confront what happened, but in 2008, she was not. And understanding that matters because it explains why abuse connected to powerful men often remains hidden for years. The silence is rarely simple. It's built from intimidation, manipulation, shame, confusion, power imbalance, and emotional survival. Think about everything Re'Shona Landfair was facing at that moment in time. She was still incredibly young. The man involved was one of the most famous musicians on earth. His supporters were loyal, his legal team was aggressive, the media attention was overwhelming, and the entire case had already become larger than her own personal experience. For the public, it was a celebrity scandal. For her, it was her life.
She was still incredibly young, but by that point the experience had already become woven into the fabric of her entire life. According to her later accounts, Re'Shona Landfair had been carrying the emotional weight of what happened to her since she was around 13 years old. The shame did not begin when the public learned about the tape. It began long before that, growing silently inside her while she tried to live a normal life around an experience she was never emotionally equipped to process. And then the humiliation became public. Landfair has said she was around 17 years old when she first became aware that the videotape was circulating. Imagine trying to survive high school, friendships, family life, and young adulthood while knowing that one of the most painful moments of your life had become gossip, controversy, and entertainment for strangers. By the time the trial finally took place in 2008, she was in her early 20s. That detail matters because people often look backward at silence and mistakenly interpret it as indifference, inconsistency, or weakness. But silence in situations involving grooming and abuse is rarely simple, especially when the victim entered the situation as a child. This was not somebody casually refusing to speak. This was a young woman who, according to her own account, had been manipulated from adolescence by one of the most powerful entertainers in the country. Someone raised in a culture where deeply personal trauma was often kept private. Someone surrounded by adults who either did not fully understand what was happening, felt powerless to stop it, or were themselves tangled in complicated relationships with Kelly and his influence. And those family connections made everything even more emotionally difficult. Because when someone like RKelly became embedded inside families, careers, and financial relationships, speaking out no longer threatened only the abuser, it threatened entire networks of people connected to him. For years, rumors circulated publicly that families around Kelly had been paid to remain silent. The allegation became one of the most controversial and emotionally charged parts of the entire saga. But when Landfair later addressed those claims, the picture she described was far more complicated than the public narrative many people imagined. According to her account, money did not simply function as payment for willing silence. It functioned inside a chaotic environment that Kelly himself allegedly helped create. An environment filled with dependency, emotional confusion, instability, secrecy, pressure, and power imbalance. In situations like that, financial support can become tangled together with survival itself. And that complexity is part of why these cases are so difficult for outsiders to fully understand from a distance. The acquittal in 2008, therefore, did not necessarily mean justice had been served. It meant the legal system operated exactly as it was designed to operate, requiring proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And at that moment in time, the central witness, a young woman still carrying years of fear, shame, manipulation, and emotional trauma, was not yet able to publicly confront what had happened to her inside a courtroom watched by the entire country. So on June 13, 2008, the jury acquitted RKelly on all 14 remaining counts. Kelly walked out of the courthouse a free man, and for a while, the noise surrounding the case faded. But silence like that rarely lasts forever, especially in cases where multiple people have allegedly carried the same pain for years. Nearly a decade later, the world would begin revisiting the allegations with a completely different level of seriousness. In July 2017, a major BuzzFeed investigation published accusations from parents who claimed Kelly was holding young women in what they described as an abusive and controlling environment. Those allegations reignited public attention and forced many people to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the earlier case. Then came the documentaries. In 2018, the BBC released reporting that further amplified accusations against Kelly. But the true turning point arrived on January 3, 2019, when Lifetime aired the 6-part documentary series SurvivingRKelly, produced by Dream Hampton. The impact was immediate and enormous, because it was not just one accusation anymore. It was the cumulative emotional force of multiple women sitting in front of cameras, using their real names and faces, describing years of alleged isolation, manipulation, fear, control, and abuse in painfully similar ways. One testimony reinforced another. Patterns became visible. Behaviors that once sounded isolated suddenly appeared systemic, and for many viewers, it became impossible to look away. The documentary featured women including Jerhonda Pace, who alleged she began a sexual relationship with Kelly at 16 years old, alongside former associates and parents who described young women allegedly being isolated inside Kelly's world. The series detailed allegations of grooming tactics, promises of career opportunities, control over communication and movement, and coercive sexual behavior. For Landfair, those testimonies reportedly felt deeply familiar. She recognized pieces of her own experience inside the stories other women were finally telling publicly, and perhaps most importantly, seeing other survivors attach their real names and faces to those experiences gave her something many victims spend years searching for: validation, community, language, a framework for understanding what had happened to her. For years, she had carried those memories largely in isolation, but now the public conversation had changed. The culture that once mocked or ignored the allegations was beginning to listen differently. Still, even then, the story did not suddenly become simple, because childhood trauma and public humiliation do not end neatly with headlines or verdicts. Healing from years of manipulation, shame, and exploitation is not something that happens overnight. In many cases, it becomes a lifelong process. But while the emotional wounds remained unresolved, the legal system was finally beginning to move again. In February 2019, prosecutors in Cook County charged Kelly with 10 counts of aggravated sexual abuse involving 4 alleged victims dating back between 1998 and 2010. Then, on July 11, 2019, federal authorities arrested him in Chicago with sweeping charges filed out of the Eastern District of New York. The allegations now included racketeering, sex trafficking, forced labor, child exploitation, in violations of the Mann Act. This was no longer being treated as isolated misconduct. Federal prosecutors argued that Kelly had operated something closer to a criminal enterprise, a system that allegedly used fame, money, employees, and intimidation to recruit, isolate, and control young women and girls over the course of decades. Multiple judges denied Kelly bail, describing him as a potential flight risk,
and after years where accountability seemed permanently stalled, the machine of prosecution was finally moving forward at full speed. Kelly's first federal trial began on August 18, 2021, in Brooklyn, New York, before U.S. District Judge Ann M. Donnelly. This time, prosecutors approached the case differently. Instead of focusing narrowly on one videotape or one individual accusation, they painted a much broader picture. They argued that for nearly 25 years, Kelly allegedly used his celebration status in Inner Circle to identify vulnerable girls and young women, some reportedly as young as 14, and draw them into abusive relationships built on manipulation, fear, dependency, and control.